He was old, black, and dressed in a plain suit, nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just a quiet man with careful steps and a first-class ticket in his weathered hand. And still, the flight crew laughed. Not behind his back, not in whispers, but right there at the gate as they asked him, twice, if he was lost. He wasn't. But what followed wasn't just a mistake. It was a chain reaction of prejudice, arrogance, and humiliation captured on video and witnessed by a cabin full of silent onlookers. They moved him to the back without apology, questioned his right to board, served drinks over him like he wasn't there. What no one realized, what none of them even thought to ask, was who he really was. And when the truth landed, it hit harder than turbulence. This is the story of how a quiet act of racism unraveled at 30,000 feet, exposing a truth that changed everyone on board. If you're watching this, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you were there? Because what happened next is something they'll never forget. And neither will you. The boarding call for Flight 930 echoed crisply through Terminal B, each syllable bouncing across the clean white walls and glistening tile floors. Business travelers began rising from their seats in unison, some still tapping away on their phones, others finishing their coffee or organizing their briefcases. The atmosphere was routine, calm, methodical. The usual shuffle of priority passengers eager to settle into their first-class seats. At the front of the boarding line stood Derek Langford, Skylux Air's senior flight attendant, sharp in his navy blazer, gold wing pin gleaming under the terminal lights. With his practiced smile and clipped efficiency, he scanned each pass with the smooth authority of someone who thrived on control. When the elderly black man stepped forward in line, Derek barely glanced at him at first. Dressed in a faded gray suit, the man carried only a leather duffel, no flashy luggage, no designer tags, no hurried phone calls or self-important chatter. He moved slowly, deliberately, but not without dignity. His gait suggested age, not weakness. His expression was calm. He held out his boarding pass with a quiet nod, saying nothing. Derek's eyes flicked to the pass, then to the man. A subtle hesitation crept into his movement. The pass clearly read, Seat 2, A First Class, but Derek's lips tightened anyway. He looked up again, as if expecting a hidden camera. "Sir," Derek said smoothly, his voice dipped in false politeness, "this line is for first-class boarding." The elderly man remained composed. "That's right," he replied gently. Derek blinked, then scanned the ticket again. The scanner chirped an accepting tone. "Are you sure this is your flight?" Derek asked, his voice a little louder now. A couple behind the man shifted forward slightly, watching. The man simply nodded. "I'm sure." Derek turned to his fellow attendant, muttering under his breath. The attendant, a younger woman named Kelly, frowned, checking her tablet. After a beat, she nodded. "He's on the manifest." But Derek wasn't convinced. "Sir," he said, now speaking more slowly, "could you please step aside for a moment while we check the system? We've had some ticketing errors lately." The man complied without protest. He stepped to the side of the line, standing upright, hands folded around the handle of his duffel. Derek continued scanning other passengers in line while whispering back and forth with Kelly. A woman in heels walked by, glanced at the man, then at Derek. "Is he lost?" she asked under her breath. Derek didn't respond. A man in a designer jacket shook his head and whispered to his companion, "First class isn't what it used to be." Another chuckled. Maybe someone's grandpa printed a fake ticket. 10 minutes passed. Derek tapped repeatedly at his screen, despite confirmation from Kelly that the boarding pass was valid. The elderly man remained still. His shoulders were square, but his eyes had dropped to the floor now, fixed on the blue carpet. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He had no intention of raising his voice, not anymore. He'd done that in his younger days. Now he knew better. Derek finally gave a short sigh, exaggerated for effect. "All right," he said. "It seems your seat is valid. You can go ahead." He waved the man through with a dismissive gesture, the kind meant to brush someone off without further engagement. The man nodded once, said nothing, and walked through the gate. Kelly looked after him, something uneasy in her eyes. But Derek just muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath and went back to the next passenger. Inside the jet bridge, the hum of recycled air met the man as he stepped forward slowly. His body was careful, each movement deliberate. When he entered the aircraft, the interior was immaculate, leather seats, soft lighting, champagne already being served. The man moved quietly to seat 2A and stowed his duffel overhead. He sat without a sound. The other first-class passengers barely looked up. A man a few rows back narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. Across the aisle, a young couple exchanged glances. Derek passed by shortly after, speaking warmly to a man in 1B about the wine selection. He didn't look at the man in 2A. The plane filled. Families in coach struggled to manage bags and kids. Business travelers argued with attendants about overhead space. But in first class, the silence was padded and insulated, meant for deals, luxury, and control. Isaiah Freeman, the man in 2A, looked out the window. He didn't touch the in-flight menu. He didn't request a drink. His mind drifted. He wasn't hurt. He was used to this. But that didn't mean it didn't cut. That didn't mean it didn't stick. From the reflection in the glass, he could see fragments of faces in nearby seats, some already engrossed in their tablets, others mid-conversation. He saw no one looking directly at him now, but he still felt the residue of the suspicion he had endured at the gate. There was a weight to that kind of scrutiny, one that didn't lift just because the seatbelt sign had illuminated. Behind the curtain separating first class from the front galley, Derek leaned against a storage panel, sipping from a water bottle, and speaking in a hushed voice to two off-duty pilots sitting in jump seats reserved for overflow crew. The pilots were in uniform but relaxed, their posture casual, eyes amused. Derek, emboldened by what he assumed was a like-minded audience, nodded subtly toward Isaiah's seat and smirked. "Can you believe that guy?" he said, voice low but sharp with sarcasm. "Wanders into first class like he's won a contest." One of the pilots chuckled, shaking his head. Figured he'd ask for help to find the bathroom, not settle in for wine service. Derek snorted. He looked so lost, like someone's grandfather trying to relive his heyday before economy crushes his back. The three men laughed quietly, shielding their mirth behind the safety of the galley curtain. Derek's voice grew bolder with each jab. "The suit's probably older than I am. I bet the zipper on that duffel's hanging on by a prayer." A few feet away, Kelly, the younger attendant, overheard the conversation as she checked the beverage cart. She glanced toward the curtain, a flicker of discomfort in her expression, but said nothing. She wasn't new to how things were, but still, something about the tone made her stomach turn. She cast a glance toward Isaiah, who hadn't moved. He sat with the same quiet dignity, his head tilted slightly, eyes on the window, lips pressed together in a straight line. He hadn't heard the jokes, or maybe he had, and simply refused to give him power. The plane lifted off the ground with a rumble, climbing steadily into the gray veil of early evening. As the engines hummed beneath them, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. Derek returned to the aisle, resuming his professional face, all smiles and service. He began taking drink orders from the first-class passengers, stopping at each row with well-practiced charm. When he reached Isaiah, his expression flickered briefly. "Would you like anything to drink?" he asked, voice clipped. Isaiah met his gaze, measured, calm. "Water, please." Derek nodded curtly and moved on. Moments later, he returned with a glass of water, setting it on the tray without a word. Isaiah offered a soft thank you, but Derek was already addressing the passenger in 2B, a blonde woman in her 30s who smiled brightly and requested champagne. Derek's voice lifted an octave for her, full of warmth and attentiveness. Isaiah turned back to the window. In the row behind them, a family of 4 settled into their seats. The father, a man with thinning hair and a navy blazer, leaned forward slightly and whispered to his wife, "Looks like Skylux is doing charity upgrades now." She covered her mouth to suppress a laugh, replying, "Or maybe it's bring your grandpa to first class day." Their teenage daughter, overhearing, smirked and added, "Wonder if he even knows how to turn on the screen." Their son giggled. The family's laughter was quiet, but not quiet enough. Isaiah's shoulders tensed. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't turn. But the words found their mark. Like needles in soft wood, they embedded themselves silently. The flight continued with the monotonous rhythm of altitude. Ice clinked in glasses. Forks tapped porcelain. The cabin, a floating world above the clouds, buzzed with a privileged hum of people used to comfort. But comfort was elusive for Isaiah. The seat was fine. The service was tolerable. But the air had turned cold, not in temperature, but in the invisible way people can shut out another human being with a glance, a whisper, or silence itself. At one point, the man in seat 3, a tall, tanned, wearing loafers with no socks, stood to stretch and glanced toward Isaiah. He gave a tight-lipped smile and said, "Big step up from economy, huh?" Isaiah looked up slowly, offering a nod but no words. The man chuckled, adjusting his collar. "Don't worry, the free wine makes it worth it." He returned to his seat, still smirking. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them, gazing forward. He didn't have the energy to engage. Not tonight. Not again. Kelly returned to his row a while later, gently adjusting the tray table in front of him. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked. He looked up. For a second, he saw no judgment in her eyes, just a trace of concern. "I'm fine," he said. She hesitated, nodded, then moved on. But in that fleeting moment, he recognized something. Not sympathy, not pity, just discomfort. The kind you feel when you realize you're part of something quietly cruel and don't know how to undo it. Derek came by again toward the midpoint of the flight, handing out warm towels. When he reached Isaiah, he extended the towel with a forced smile, saying nothing. Isaiah took it, nodded. Derek moved on. Behind the forced civility, the tension remained. The first-class cabin was a place of peace for most. For Isaiah, it had become a chamber of humiliation, a quiet, padded room where every laugh was a reminder, every glance a question, every silence an answer. He had said nothing since takeoff, had not requested a blanket, had not reclined his seat. He had mastered invisibility, not by choice, but by necessity, cultivated through decades of knowing that visibility often brought discomfort, confrontation, or worse. He existed in that seat as a presence rather than a participant, a silent man surrounded by quiet judgment. Derek reappeared at the front of the cabin, clipboard in hand, his expression suddenly concerned. He began moving down the aisle with deliberate purpose, pausing at each seat, scanning tickets on his screen, and murmuring short apologies or affirmations to each guest. His gestures were exaggerated, his demeanor businesslike, but underneath his professionalism, there was a glint of something else. When he reached Isaiah's seat, he stopped, tilted the screen toward himself, and sighed. "Excuse me, sir," he said, loud enough for several nearby passengers to look up. "It appears there's been a system error with your seat assignment." Isaiah slowly turned his head toward Derek. His expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "System error?" he repeated, his tone low. Derek nodded. "Yes, sir. It seems this seat was double booked. We didn't catch it at boarding. I'm afraid we'll have to reseat you." He emphasized the word reseat as though offering a minor inconvenience rather than a removal. Isaiah didn't respond immediately. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket, withdrew the boarding pass, and handed it to Derek. The attendant accepted it, pretending to study it, although he already knew what it said. "Yes, this says 2A," he confirmed. "But unfortunately, the system updated mid-flight. We're resolving it now. I'll show you to your new seat." He stepped back and gestured toward the rear of the cabin, his other hand still gripping the tablet. Isaiah's gaze held steady. "Where exactly is this new seat?" Derek hesitated for a beat. "In economy. It's the only open seat available. We apologize for the inconvenience." Around them, whispers began again. The woman in 2B shifted away slightly. The man in 3A leaned forward, his interest piqued. Someone a few rows back murmured, "Told you." Isaiah didn't argue. He simply nodded once and unbuckled his belt with slow, steady hands. He stood, reached for his duffel in the overhead bin, and followed Derek silently down the aisle. He could feel the eyes trailing him, scanning his back like a living headline. His quiet footsteps through the first-class aisle echoed in his own ears, each step a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, he was still perceived through a lens someone else controlled. As he crossed the threshold from first class to economy, the differences became even more jarring. The space shrank. The lighting dimmed. Voices were louder, more chaotic. Passengers shuffled to make space as Derek led Isaiah to the very last row of the plane, a narrow space beside the rear lavatory, directly beside the galley, where the scent of reheated meals and the hum of machinery never truly stopped. Derek gestured to the middle seat in the final row. "Here we are," he said, as though delivering good news. Isaiah looked down at the cramped seat. One side was pressed against the lavatory wall, the other hemmed in by a man with a massive build, arms spilling over the armrest. The aisle seat was already occupied by a teenager in a hoodie, legs sprawled. Neither passenger looked up. Isaiah nodded again and sat, maneuvering his frame into the limited space. Derek offered no apology. He simply turned and walked back up the aisle. In the back of the plane, the mood was different. There was no champagne, no quiet dignity, no whispering. People were too busy getting through the flight. A crying child echoed a few rows up. Someone's headphones leaked tinny music. The man beside Isaiah exhaled audibly and shifted, annoyed by the shared space. Isaiah kept his hands folded in his lap, his breathing even, his posture careful. He didn't complain. He didn't press the call button. He knew exactly what had happened. He also knew that if he responded in anger, he would become the problem instead of the victim. That was the trap. Always was. Back in first class, Derek returned to the galley and shrugged at Kelly. "System glitch," he said, grinning slightly. "Nothing I could do." Kelly glanced at him but said nothing. She had seen the screen. She knew no such error had occurred. But she also knew that objecting now would put her at odds with someone who could affect her hours, her evaluations, and her career. So she looked away, back at the drawer she was organizing, and let silence do the heavy lifting. The passengers in first class resumed their comfort, some acknowledging the situation with smirks, others pretending not to notice at all. A woman a few seats ahead leaned toward her husband and whispered, "They moved him out." He nodded. Finally, she laughed. "I was worried they were just going to leave him up here, the whole flight." Their conversation faded into the background hum. Isaiah sat still, eyes forward, wedged between strangers, and breathing through his nose to ignore the scent of chemical disinfectant from the lavatory. Each vibration of the engines resonated through the thin seat frame. Every shift of the man beside him pressed further into his ribs. But he did not move. He had learned how to fold into discomfort, how to inhabit pain without acknowledging it. These were old skills, rehearsed, refined. Near the front of the plane, the teenager who had earlier filmed Derek's exchange at boarding looked back, searching for the man he'd recorded. When he spotted him at the very back, he frowned. Something about it didn't sit right. Quietly, he opened his phone and began reviewing the footage. Meanwhile, the sky outside darkened further as the plane glided into twilight, streaks of red and purple chasing the horizon. The hush of altitude surrounded them, but the real turbulence wasn't outside. It moved in whispers, in glances, in quiet exclusions, so practiced they no longer needed to be spoken aloud. There was no space to reclaim, no comfort to assert. The aisle seat remained occupied by the teenager in the hoodie, earbuds in place, but glancing occasionally at Isaiah as if trying to understand what he was seeing without drawing attention. The economy cabin buzzed with uneven activity. The sounds were louder here, plastic crinkling, overhead bins creaking open, flight attendants shifting trays, and low conversations between tired travelers. As meal service approached, Isaiah pressed the call button once. A faint chime sounded above him, the soft glow of the light marking his row. He waited. A flight attendant passed by, pushing a cart, and glanced in his direction, then quickly turned back to the task of rearranging soda cans. She didn't stop. Isaiah waited another 5 minutes and pressed the button again. The chime sounded once more, quiet but distinct. He folded his hands again and waited. No one came. The cart moved through the aisle, stopping and starting, blocking the view of the front. Isaiah's section was skipped. He could smell the meals being heated, the scent of warm rolls and reheated pasta drifting toward him as trays were handed over to the rows ahead. At row 32, the attendants paused, handed out meals, smiled, then moved on. At row 33, they did the same. Isaiah sat in 34. The cart rolled past. He watched it go. Neither attendant looked his way. They stopped 3 rows ahead, chatted softly as they shifted something in the galley, then resumed serving. The teenager removed one earbud and looked over. "Did they skip you?" he asked quietly. Isaiah didn't look at him. "It's fine," he said. The boy frowned. "No, it's not." He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll through music. He opened the camera instead and began recording, angling the device subtly to include both Isaiah and the passing crew. He said nothing more, but the crease between his eyebrows deepened. Isaiah said nothing else either. There was no tone of defeat in his voice, only fatigue. The kind of fatigue that settles deep and stays lodged beneath the skin. A flight attendant finally approached, not because of a call light, but because she was clearing trash from previous rows. She looked surprised to see Isaiah, still holding his empty tray table down. "Did you not get your meal, sir?" she asked, her tone bland. Isaiah met her eyes. "No," she nodded curtly. "I'll see if we have anything left." She didn't return. At the front of the plane, Derek stood behind the curtain with another attendant named Rachel. She was in her 30s, blonde, with the weary professionalism of someone who had flown a dozen overnight legs in the past 2 weeks. Derek sipped from a thermos and smirked. "Our friend in 34C still pressing that call button," he said under his breath. Rachel gave a quick laugh. "You're terrible." Derek shrugged. "Come on." He makes a scene at the gate, takes up first-class space like he owns the place, and now he wants water service like he's the CEO. Rachel shook her head, chuckling quietly. "You think he actually thought he'd get away with it?" Derek raised both eyebrows dramatically. He had that look. You know the type. Quiet, stubborn, righteous. Thought if he acted polite enough, nobody would question him. That only works when you don't stand out. They laughed again, the sound muffled but not silent. A passenger, seated near the curtain, glanced up but quickly returned to his tablet. Behind them, Kelly leaned against the bulkhead. Her jaw was tight. She didn't laugh. She looked down at the manifest in her hand and then back toward the curtain that led to the economy cabin. She had seen the passenger list. She had watched Derek remove Isaiah from a confirmed seat. She had seen the way the service skipped 34C, and she had heard every word of the mocking. But she said nothing. Not yet. The teenager in 34D angled his phone toward the aisle again. He had caught some of the exchange at the curtain, audio faint, but distinguishable. He replayed it twice, frowning deeper each time. Then he hit record again, this time narrating quietly. They skipped him on purpose. "I don't know who he is, but they're not even hiding it. He asked for water. He asked for food. Nobody came." He paused the recording and looked at Isaiah. "I'm posting this," he said softly. Isaiah turned to him. There was no anger in his eyes, only something unreadable, something layered with age and memory. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," the boy replied. "That's why I am." He tapped the screen, hit post, and watched the upload bar fill. Up front, Derek had returned to his aisle rounds. He moved through first class, checking on passengers with exaggerated politeness. "Another blanket, sir?" "Of course." "Would you like a second dessert?" "Let me see what I can do." His voice, sweetened with artificial warmth, filled the cabin like background music in a hotel lobby. Meanwhile, the back of the plane remained what it had always been, ignored, underlit, and forgotten. Isaiah leaned his head against the thin plastic of a wall beside him. The engine vibrated through his skull, a dull thrum that blurred into the quiet ache behind his eyes. He could still feel the tension in his back from the stiff seat, still smell the chemical cleaner from the lavatory beside him, still taste the dryness on his tongue from the unanswered call light. His body was present, but his mind had begun to move inward. There was no justice coming, not at this altitude, not in this cabin. But there was memory. There was always memory. He closed his eyes. Elsewhere in the cabin, the teenager refreshed his feed. The video had already reached 500 views. Then 1,000. Comments began to appear. "This is disgusting. What airline is this? Why didn't they serve him? This is 2025. The boy leaned back and slipped the phone into his pocket. He didn't say anything to Isaiah. He didn't need to. The post was spreading now, and momentum had a mind of its own. At the front, Kelly finally approached Rachel and whispered something into her ear. Rachel looked up, surprised, then turned toward Derek, who was now pouring champagne for the couple in 2C and 2D. "He's trending," Kelly said. "Who?" Derek asked, not looking up. "The man you kicked out of first class," Kelly said. "Someone posted it. It's spreading." Derek laughed. "So? People post everything these days. It'll disappear in 20 minutes. But his smile faltered for a moment, not because he feared exposure, but because he hated the idea that someone outside his control had decided to make it public. The tray table in front of him remained clean and empty, the cup holder dry, the space around him untouched by hospitality. The smell of reheated food had long faded, replaced now with stale cabin air and the occasional chemical sting of nearby disinfectant. The boy beside him, quiet but alert, refreshed his post and noted the numbers rising steadily. Thousands of views, dozens of reposts, then hundreds. Comments flooded in like water through a broken levee. People weren't just watching now, they were reacting. Outrage swirled through the hashtags. Words like disgusting and unacceptable and racism speckled the feed. One user tagged the airline's official account, then another. Within 10 minutes, Flight 930 had become more than a flight. It had become a question hanging in the air, unanswered. In business class, seated near the emergency exit for extra legroom, a woman in a dark navy blazer opened her work phone and scanned the top of the screen where a ping had just appeared. She blinked once, adjusted her glasses, and opened the alert. Her name was Laurention, Director of Cabin Experience for Skylux Air. She was flying incognito for the exact reason her phone had just buzzed: anonymous evaluations of in-flight crew. A live incident flag had reached her dashboard. Internal social monitoring had picked up a viral post concerning Flight 930, specifically Seat 34C. She read the details. Skipped meal service. Ignored call lights. Passenger removed from first class without cause. Possible discrimination. Lauren had reviewed thousands of reports in her career, but rarely did they escalate mid-flight. She looked around the cabin. Everything looked normal. Too normal. That in itself made her suspicious. She stood up, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, and walked toward the front. She reached the galley area, where Rachel and Kelly were rearranging service carts and Derek was standing casually with a napkin in hand. He turned as she approached, his smile immediate but cautious. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked with practiced courtesy. Lauren offered a neutral smile in return. "Yes," she said calmly, producing a slim ID badge from her inner coat pocket. Laurention, Cabin Experience Oversight. Derek's smile faltered just slightly. "Of course. How can we assist?" She didn't answer his question right away. Instead, she turned to Kelly. "Can you bring me the passenger manifest and the seat assignment history for 2A and 34C?" Kelly blinked, surprised, but nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Derek crossed his arms, still composed. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Lauren kept her voice level. "We've received a report that a passenger was removed from first class under questionable circumstances and hasn't been served since. I'm here to verify the records." Derek glanced at Rachel, who avoided his eyes. He replied quickly, "It was a system error. Double-booked seat. We had to reassign. It happens." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "I'm aware of booking errors. That's why I'm checking the logs." Kelly returned with a printed manifest and a tablet. Lauren accepted both and scrolled through the tablet's interface with the speed and familiarity of someone who had reviewed thousands of such documents. She stopped at 2A. The original name listed was Freeman, Isaiah. Reassignment was logged at gate entry. Lauren tapped again. The reassignment note was vague. It had no supervisor override code, no double booking tag, and most importantly, no record of a secondary passenger needing the seat. The timeline showed Isaiah had checked in, was assigned 2A, then was moved manually to 34C by crew ID DL 073. Derek Langford. Lauren looked up. There was no duplicate assignment, no error. This was a manual reassignment. Derek shifted slightly. Well, yes, I moved him, but we believed the ticket was an error at the time. Believed? Lauren asked, voice still calm but pointed. Based on what? Derek paused. The boarding pass didn't match the passenger. I mean, he stopped himself. It seemed suspicious. Lauren lowered the tablet. You profiled him. That's not what happened, Derek replied quickly. He didn't look, he didn't carry himself like. Again, he stopped. Lauren let the silence stretch. Like what exactly? Derek's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer that wouldn't sound worse than silence. Lauren turned to Kelly again. Was there a service issue in 34C? Kelly looked torn, her eyes flicking between Lauren and Derek. He pressed the call button twice. I saw it. I offered to get food later, but I never went back. Why not? Kelly hesitated. Derek said he didn't want any special treatment, that he was fine. Did he say that? Lauren asked. Kelly shook her head. No. Derek said it. I assumed. You assumed wrong. Lauren straightened, handing the tablet back. Where is Mr. Freeman now? Still in 34C, Kelly said quietly. Lauren stepped back into the aisle. I'm going to speak with him. She moved through the cabin quickly, her heels quiet but steady on the carpet. As she passed through business and economy, passengers glanced at her, noting her authority. She reached the last row and paused. Isaiah opened his eyes. Lauren nodded once. Mr. Freeman, may I have a moment? He looked at her, expression unreadable. Of course. My name is Lauren Shun. I represent the airline. I'd like to apologize for your treatment. It was not in line with company standards. Isaiah's gaze remained steady. And yet, it was done by your company. I know, she replied. That's why I'm here. The teenager in the aisle leaned in. Everyone online knows too. It's blowing up. Laura nodded. We're aware, and we're taking action. That fast? The boy asked. Some things shouldn't take long, she replied. She turned back to Isaiah. The woman beside him in 2B sat straighter than before, no longer leaning into the aisle or occupying more than her share of space. The air held something else now, something that hadn't existed when he had first taken this seat, a question unspoken, but growing. Lauren had returned to business class, her expression unreadable as she typed rapid notes into her phone, coordinating with the airline's ground team. Derek lingered in the front galley, subdued, every movement now watched by the passengers and crew alike. He no longer moved with authority. He no longer smiled. The power he had used to push a man down the aisle was gone, exposed for what it was. Isaiah, by contrast, had not changed. His back remained straight. His hands remained folded in his lap. He looked out the window not to see, but simply to rest his eyes from the scrutiny. Beverage service resumed awkwardly. The flight attendants, unsure whether to continue with normal protocol, moved cautiously through the cabin. When Kelly arrived at Isaiah's seat, her voice was gentler, but her hands trembled slightly. May I get you something to drink, Mr. Freeman? She asked. He looked up and gave a soft nod. Tea. No sugar. Of course, she said, stepping away to prepare it herself instead of pulling from a cart. While she moved, Isaiah reached into the interior pocket of his blazer and retrieved a slim, matte black phone, smaller than a modern smartphone, unbranded, utilitarian. He pressed a single button and lifted it to his ear. No one else noticed the call being placed, but the steward in the front galley, a young man fresh out of training, happened to glance down the aisle just as Isaiah raised the device. There was no sense of urgency in Isaiah's posture, only calm authority. He spoke a single sentence into the phone, quietly but with clarity. Tell them to circle once more. Then he ended the call and slipped the device back into his coat. The young steward frowned. He had heard the words clearly enough to recognize them as an instruction, but they made no sense. Who was them? Circle what? He considered asking Kelly, but something about the tone had given him pause. Not just the words, but the delivery. It wasn't a request. It was an order, as natural and practiced as a captain giving flight directions. The steward said nothing and kept moving. Outside, dusk had turned the sky into a wash of violet and slate blue. As the aircraft reached its cruising speed again, the sun dipped just below the horizon, bathing the clouds in a line of fading gold. That's when the whispers began. A passenger in 1D looked out his window and narrowed his eyes. He pressed a hand to the glass, squinting into the fading light. Then he leaned back and whispered something to his wife. She craned her neck to see, her mouth tightening slightly. Another passenger 2 rows back glanced over and followed their gaze. "Is that another plane?" someone asked, loud enough for a few heads to turn. From the left side of the aircraft, just behind the wing, a sleek black jet maintained an exact, parallel course. It was smaller than their commercial plane, but fast, precise, its form almost predatory. The surface of the jet reflected little light. It moved in a clean, uninterrupted line, almost silent to the passengers aboard Flight 930, but unmistakably close. The gap between them was tight, closer than FAA regulations usually allowed for standard traffic. In the cockpit, the co-pilot noted the presence of the trailing aircraft on radar and called it in. The response from ground control was nonchalant. "Private clearance verified. VIP transit. Do not deviate." The captain raised his eyebrows. "Tailgating us like that for 30 miles? They've got full clearance," came the reply. "Special designation." The captain said nothing further. He glanced at the digital ID tag of the aircraft. Non-standard, partial encryption. Not government, but not commercial either. He didn't like it, but he didn't argue. Back in first class, the passengers were no longer whispering. They were openly looking out their windows. Derek emerged from the galley, saw the jet, and froze. Rachel stepped beside him. "You think that's normal?" she asked. "Maybe someone famous," Derek replied too quickly. "Movie star. Politician." He didn't sound convinced. Kelly returned with Isaiah's tea and handed it to him without a word. He accepted it with a nod, took one sip, then resumed looking out the window. The jet remained just visible, shadowing their course. There was no insignia, no markings. Its presence alone unsettled the cabin, as if it knew more about the destination than the pilots did. Lauren, now back in her seat, tapped out a secure message on her device and checked the corporate channel for updates. Nothing had been flagged. No celebrity manifests. No diplomatic clearances matching that flight path. She tilted her screen, zoomed in on a surveillance tag, and froze. The aircraft type was registered as a modified Gulfstream, but the operator was listed as Private Holdings Freeman. She reread the last word, then glanced toward the front of the plane. To A. Isaiah Freeman. No one had told her who he really was. No one had to. She closed the screen, leaned back in her seat, and stared forward in silence. The teenager who had posted the video earlier now filmed the dark jet outside his window. "There's a jet following us," he whispered in the video. "It's not a military jet. It's not a news chopper. It's private. And it hasn't left us for over 30 minutes. He posted it. Views surged again. Derek, pacing near the galley, now began to sweat. The tension was visible on his face, despite his best efforts to maintain composure. He approached Rachel. "We need to find out who that guy is," he whispered. "Which guy?" "C2A. Why?" Rachel asked. Derek glanced around to make sure no one could hear. "Because that jet didn't show up until after he made a phone call." Rachel stared. "What are you saying?" "I don't know," Derek admitted. "But I don't think he's who we thought." The presence of the mysterious black jet still pacing them outside the left wing had changed something intangible in the air. Every glance from a window now lingered a beat longer. Every word spoken by the crew was measured, softened, carefully rehearsed. And at the center of that change, invisible yet unmissable, sat Isaiah Freeman, still into A, still silent, still dignified, but no longer overlooked. In the cockpit, a flashing prompt drew the captain's attention to a priority message from Skylux Air Corporate Headquarters. The captain tapped the screen, skimmed the first line, and stiffened. The message was coded in a tone unmistakable to any pilot who'd spent time under major corporate structure. High-level urgency with no option for delay. The captain cleared his throat and gestured to his co-pilot to take the controls. He read the directive again, slower this time. A specific passenger, name, Freeman Isaiah, was confirmed to have been seated in 2A at departure, but was identified in a recent incident report as having been relocated without cause. A real-time executive alert had been issued after video footage from the flight went viral, and a pattern of crew misconduct was confirmed by internal social surveillance. The instruction was simple: immediately restore Mr. Freeman to his original seating assignment if he has not yet been reinstated. Identify all crew responsible for the reassignment and prepare for direct intervention upon landing. There was a final sentence, bolded. The tailing jet belongs to Mr. Freeman. Full discretion and immediate courtesy required. Do not delay. The captain blinked, took a breath, and radioed the lead purser. Get me Derek Langford in the galley. Now, back in first class. Derek stood leaning near the forward lavatory, arms crossed, eyes unfocused as he stared out toward the back of the plane. The jet still followed. It hadn't deviated in over an hour. Derek's usual calm had eroded steadily since Isaiah's return to Seat 2A. There had been no confrontation, no direct complaints from the passenger, but something about the silence, his lack of protest, the way he sipped his tea and met no one's eyes, made it all worse. Derek's authority had never needed confrontation to work. It relied on silent compliance. Now, Isaiah's silence read differently. Not compliance, but patience. That terrified Derek more than anger. The intercom crackled above him. Derek to the galley. Immediately, he straightened. The voice belonged to the captain, and the tone wasn't a request. It was surgical. He adjusted his blazer, gave Rachel a look that asked a silent question she didn't answer, and walked briskly into the galley. The captain was waiting on a secured call, headset still in one ear. He gestured for Derek to close the curtain. Derek complied. The captain didn't waste time. We've received a directive from Skylux HQ regarding passenger Isaiah Freeman. Derek's brow furrowed. Sir, he's already been reseated. The captain didn't blink. That's not the issue anymore. What is the issue? Derek asked carefully. The captain set his tablet down on the galley counter and turned the screen so Derek could see. There, in bold white font on black interface, was the internal incident log, and beneath it the words, Asset, Freeman Isaiah. Executive Advisory Status. Priority Traveler. Verified Ownership, Tail Aircraft ID, FJX 930F Art. Derek read it again, and again. That's his jet, he asked, voice almost inaudible. The captain nodded. That's his jet, and that's his seat. You reassigned him without cause, and now corporate is watching closely. Derek opened his mouth, but no words came. The captain leaned in. You just humiliated the man who owns the jet tailing us. The man who co-owns the holding group that controls half our route portfolio in the Northeast. The man whose name sits on our executive stakeholder ledger. Derek's mouth went dry. He looked again at the name, Isaiah Freeman. Until now, it had just been a boarding pass, an anomaly, a perceived error to be corrected. Now it was something else entirely. It was the name of a man with reach, power, and the kind of poise that didn't demand respect. It commanded it silently. The captain stepped closer. You will apologize. Directly, sincerely. You will offer anything he requests. If he wants the entire row to himself, he gets it. If he wants you to serve him personally the rest of the flight, you do it. And when we land, you stay seated until corporate arrives. Do you understand? Derek nodded, his face pale. The captain stepped back. Then go. Now. Derek exited the galley, hands stiff at his sides, breath shallow. The aisle stretched before him like a runway lined with judgment. He walked slowly toward 2A, the buzz of passengers rising slightly as they noticed him approaching. Eyes followed, voices hushed. Even Rachel peeked around the curtain, watching. Derek stopped at Isaiah's row. The man looked up, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. Derek stood there for a moment, unable to speak. Then, finally, he swallowed and said, "Mr. Freeman, I owe you a deep apology. I made a mistake. I misjudged you, and I allowed that judgment to affect how you were treated. That was wrong. Entirely wrong. I'm sorry." Isaiah held his gaze, unmoving. He didn't respond immediately. Then he spoke, voice even. "You didn't just misjudge me, Mr. Langford. You chose to ignore what you saw and act on what you assumed." Derek's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Isaiah continued, his tone still low. "That's not a mistake. That's a habit." Derek nodded, slowly. "You're right. What happens next," Isaiah said, "isn't up to you anymore." Derek gave another short nod. "Yes, sir." The passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Several leaned forward. Others stared openly. The tension in the air had shifted again, not with hostility, but with gravity. Everyone could feel it now. Something irreversible had occurred. The curtain had pulled back, the roles had flipped, and the man whose presence they had mocked now carried the full weight of vindication. Isaiah returned to his tea. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply existed in his space, finally acknowledged for who he was, but not because he had revealed himself, because the world had caught up. First class, which had once buzzed with private conversations, polite laughter, and dismissive glances, now sat in the stillness of dawning awareness. Passengers straightened in their seats. Window shades lifted slightly. All eyes drifted, intentionally or not, toward seat 2A. Isaiah Freeman remained composed, his posture the same as it had been since the boarding gate, upright, calm, unshaken. But now, something had changed in the way people looked at him. Not because he had declared his value, but because their assumptions had been stripped from them, one by one, until all that remained was truth. Derek stood in the galley, bracing himself against the counter as the aircraft shifted in altitude. He had delivered the apology, but the weight of it lingered in his stomach like a stone. He had seen Isaiah's eyes, not furious, not accusing, just still, as though measuring more than the apology itself, measuring the man who delivered it. Derek knew the silence wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acknowledgement. It was distance. A reminder that the damage done wasn't about a seat or a skipped drink. It was about being reduced by assumption, about the cumulative effect of quiet indignities that build and break trust without needing to raise voices. Rachel, standing a few feet away, avoided looking at him. She had heard the update. She knew now who Isaiah was. But more than that, she understood what that meant, not just in terms of corporate hierarchy, but in what it exposed about the culture they operated in. The captain made a final pass through the cabin. His voice, when it came over the speakers, was steady but more personal than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, we'd like to remind you to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are honored to have all of you aboard this evening." A pause. "Especially Mr. Freeman. Thank you for flying with us." No one missed the emphasis. Heads turned. Murmurs spread. Passengers who had dismissed him earlier now leaned toward their neighbors. "Freeman," someone whispered. "Wait, that's Freeman," a voice from row 3 asked. Another leaned forward, whispering. "Is he the one from the tail jet?" Recognition was blooming like firelight in a dark room, slow at first, then undeniable. The name Freeman meant something, not just on this flight, but in the business world, in aviation circles, in expansion strategies discussed behind closed doors. Freeman Holdings had quietly acquired controlling interest in several East Coast terminals, infrastructure projects, and yes, major air carriers, including Skylux. The tailing jet, the quiet authority, the private phone call, it all made sense now. But Isaiah hadn't said a word about it. He had let their treatment of him stand unchallenged, not because he was powerless, but because he was patient. Now finally he moved. Isaiah reached into the inner pocket of his coat, withdrew a leather portfolio, and unzipped it with steady hands. Inside was a folded document bearing the watermark of Skylux Executive Affairs. He placed it carefully on the tray table in front of him, unfolded it, and waited. Lauren Chun, seated just a few rows behind, saw the motion and rose. She approached without hesitation, her steps smooth despite the plane's descent. When she reached him, Isaiah gestured slightly to the open document. She glanced down and read the top line. Isaiah Freeman, Senior Partner, East Coast Strategic Operations Board. She looked up at him, her expression a blend of respect and apology. "Thank you for showing this," she said quietly. "You didn't have to." Isaiah offered a slight smile. "Neither did your crew." And yet they did. Lauren lowered her gaze, understanding what he meant. Not just the mistreatment, but the choice to act without knowing. To treat someone as invisible not because of anything said, but because of how he looked. Passengers nearby leaned in further. Word had spread fast. The teenage boy from the back had been following the story in real time and now approached cautiously. "Sir," he said quietly. Isaiah turned. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how they treated you. And thank you for not letting it slide." Isaiah studied him. "You saw something wrong. You spoke up. You didn't have to, but you did." The boy flushed, but nodded. "I didn't expect it to go viral." Isaiah looked past him out the window, where the dark sky gave way to the glow of the city below. Justice often begins where someone sees what others ignore. Derek watched from a galley, his face pale. He hadn't moved since the message had come through. Now, as Isaiah stood with the slow grace of someone who did not rush for anyone, Derek approached again. "Mr. Freeman," he began, voice quieter now. I didn't know." Isaiah looked at him, holding the gaze without hostility. "You didn't ask. That's the problem." Derek nodded slowly. "I'll accept whatever consequences come. He paused. "I never thought I'd be the story. I always thought I was just doing my job." Isaiah stepped closer. "Doing your job doesn't mean failing your humanity." The words landed hard. Derek nodded again. "Understood." Isaiah turned, readying for deplaning. Rachel stepped forward, too. "Sir, if there's anything I can do, you can learn," he said. "That would be a start." As the plane touched down, the cabin jolted gently. The wheels screamed against the tarmac. The city lights came into full view, shining through the windows like a second chance. Passengers remained in their seats, uncommonly still. There was no rush for overhead bins, no impatient shifting. Instead, there was awareness. The man who had been mocked moved, and ignored had never raised his voice. He had never needed to. His presence had been enough. And now, so was the truth. The moment the aircraft stopped, Isaiah was escorted by Lauren toward the front exit. Not as a spectacle, not as a show, but with respect. As they reached the threshold, the private jet visible beyond the glass, Derek stood near the bulkhead, watching them go. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the most important person in uniform. He felt like a student learning the cost of a quiet mistake made in public. A collective pause held everyone in place, like the air itself understood that what had begun at 30,000 feet would not end with a disembarkation. It would end with a reckoning. At the front of the aircraft, Derek adjusted his tie for the third time in 60 seconds. His face was pale, his hands visibly tense despite his forced posture of professionalism. Rachel stood nearby, her lips pressed tightly together, her gaze aimed just above the heads of the passengers, unwilling to meet their eyes. Kelly lingered farther back, shifting between watching Isaiah, who stood quietly near the front exit with Lauren, and glancing toward Derek with something resembling pity. Derek had said little since the captain's final instructions came through. He had understood the words, but not their weight until the final descent. Now he could feel them heavy on his chest, pressing into his breath, making even silence uncomfortable. Isaiah hadn't spoken to him again. He hadn't needed to. The jet bridge connected with a gentle shudder, and the aircraft door was pulled open by ground crew. But it wasn't just a standard handoff. Standing just beyond the door, not one but 4 individuals in dark Skylux blazers awaited. Their jackets bore the white emblem of the Skylux Compliance and Ethics Office, an internal division typically reserved for high-level investigations, far removed from normal flight operations. One stepped forward and addressed Lauren with a nod. She turned to Isaiah. "You'll be escorted directly to the terminal suite, Mr. Freeman. Please follow me." Isaiah inclined his head once in acknowledgement. Behind him, the compliance officers made no move to engage the passengers. Instead, they stepped into the aircraft and turned directly to the crew. "Mr. Langford," the lead officer said, loud enough for the nearest 2 rows to hear, "please step forward." Derek tried to hold his expression steady as he moved toward them. "You're being placed on immediate administrative suspension pending full review," the officer continued. "You'll be escorted through a private exit." Derek opened his mouth, but the officer held up a hand. "Any statements will be recorded during your official debriefing. This is not optional." Derek closed his mouth and nodded. Rachel's name was called next, then Kelly's. The 3 flight attendants were led forward in silence, not by security, not by police, but by corporate handlers whose presence was more damning in its subtlety. This wasn't about crime. This was about ethics, optics, and institutional consequences. What happened on Flight 930 had traveled beyond embarrassment. It had become a matter of policy, reputation, and accountability. As they stepped off the aircraft and into the secured portion of the terminal, the noise hit them like a wall. Outside the glass barriers beyond customs and security, news crews had already gathered. Cameras pointed toward the tarmac. Booms were raised. Reporters called out questions to no one and everyone. Across the airport's social media feeds, hashtags related to the incident dominated the trending lists. Hashtag Freeman Flight, hashtag Skylux Scandal, hashtag Justice at 30K feet. The teenager from 34D, who had quietly followed behind Isaiah and Lauren, checked his phone and saw his own video had now crossed over 12 million views. National morning shows were referencing the clip. A major civil rights lawyer had issued a statement. The story was no longer a flight incident. It was a national discussion. In the press area, monitors replayed the sequence that had been captured. Isaiah at the boarding gate being redirected, his boarding pass being questioned, his silent walk from first class to the rear, the skipped meal service, the curt treatment, the hushed laughter of the crew at the galley, and finally, the sharp contrast when his jet appeared outside the window, gliding beside the commercial airliner like a silent judge. It played again and again, framed not just as a case of poor service, but as an emblem of something older, something systemic. The narrative had caught fire because it was about more than one man. It was about every unseen man, every misjudged woman, every traveler ever told they did not belong based on nothing more than the way they looked. Isaiah watched the chaos unfold from behind tinted glass in the terminal's private suite. He stood beside Lauren, who monitored the statements being prepared by Skylux Corporate. "We'll release an acknowledgement of the misconduct within the hour," she said. "Then a full review within 72 hours. Isaiah didn't respond immediately. He was watching the monitor, where Derek and the others were now being led through a side corridor flanked by security. "Make sure your apology isn't written for shareholders," Isaiah finally said. "Make sure it's written for people who never had the chance to be heard." Lauren nodded. "Yes, sir." Meanwhile, Derek sat in a private room with 2 compliance officers. The room was plain, gray walls, no windows, a glass table, 2 chairs. He had been offered water, but declined. He stared at the wall while the officers reviewed the footage. They didn't speak to him yet. They wanted the silence to settle in first. Derek had never imagined his name trending on social media. He had never imagined the corporation he once served without question now standing across from him with a clipboard instead of a headset. The question he kept asking himself wasn't "what did I do?" It was "why didn't I see it coming?" But he already knew the answer. He had seen Isaiah and assumed weakness. He had seen politeness and assumed submission. He had equated suit quality with legitimacy and skin color with status. And now every assumption was on the table, being dissected in real time by a world that no longer ignored quiet injustice. Passengers from the flight began posting their own apologies. One woman admitted she had assumed Isaiah was in the wrong because Derek had been so certain. Another man wrote, "I looked away when they moved him. I shouldn't have." A first-class couple who had laughed when Isaiah was reassigned issued a video statement, clearly shaken. "We didn't know who he was, but that's the point. We assumed because of how he looked. We were wrong, deeply wrong. Their word spread almost as fast as the original footage. By nightfall, Flight 930 had become the symbol of something bigger than aviation. News anchors debated systemic bias in customer service. Airline executives released rapid-fire responses promising policy reviews, diversity retraining, and new oversight positions. Protests erupted at Skylux headquarters in Chicago, demanding accountability beyond suspensions. People were not satisfied with quiet HR resolutions. They wanted change that echoed, that stuck, that mattered. Inside the suite, Isaiah sipped a glass of water and checked a single message on his secure phone. It read only, "We're monitoring from DC. Thank you for holding your ground." He smiled faintly. No press conferences. No social media. No need. His presence had done the speaking for him. Lauren returned with printed statements for his review. "The media wants a quote from you directly," she said. "Only if you wish." Isaiah took the page, read the draft, and handed it back. "I don't need to say anything," he said. "You already did." He pointed to the television where yet another replay of his silent walk from first class to the back of the plane was airing. That said enough. Lauren nodded again. 1 year after the story of Flight 930 shook a nation and reshaped the internal policies of Skylux Air from top to bottom, the echoes of that moment still rippled outward, more persistent than the viral clips and louder than the press releases that had followed in its wake. In boardrooms across the country, executives had debated the implications not just for public relations, but for cultural responsibility. In customer service departments, new scripts had been written, not to pacify, but to understand. On aircrafts coast to coast, call buttons were no longer dismissed as trivial, and names were read with greater attention, not as routine formality, but as acts of recognition. And somewhere at the center of that cultural shift was a man who had never raised his voice and never asked for anyone's attention. He simply lived with presence, with patience, with truth. Derek Langford had not lost his job, not immediately. After the inquiry concluded and the footage was reviewed, after passenger testimonies and internal documents had been filed, Skylux had presented the crew involved with a decision: immediate termination or voluntary enrollment in a year-long rehabilitation and equity leadership program created in partnership with national ethics organizations and civil rights educators. The choice was simple on paper, but complex in meaning. The program wouldn't just involve sitting in a classroom. It included community immersion, service commitments, counseling, travel to historic civil rights sites, and structured reflections designed not to humiliate but to awaken. For Derek, it meant coming face to face with the version of himself that had stepped onto Flight 930 1 year ago and asking if that version was worthy of continuing. At first, he had resisted. He had drafted resignation letters, called legal counsel, cursed at a mirror. But eventually, sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the clips that had gone viral, watching the stillness of Isaiah Freeman as he was denied water, pushed to the back, ignored, humiliated, something cracked. It wasn't one big realization. It wasn't guilt. It was clarity, a deep, raw understanding that the man he had seen that day had not failed to meet expectations. Derek had failed to see the person in front of him. Not because Isaiah had done anything wrong, but because Derek had never truly learned to look without filtering others through his assumptions. He had treated authority like a birthright, not a responsibility. That clarity hurt, so he enrolled. The program was relentless. He cleaned shelters in Baltimore where displaced travelers sought refuge during flight cancellations. He sat in restorative justice circles in Atlanta, where strangers shared stories of casual cruelty that mirrored his own behavior. He traveled to Selma and walked the Edmund Pettus Bridge alone at dawn, the fog thick around his feet. He met retired pilots and current flight attendants of color who had stories far worse than the one that reached headlines. Each time he tried to explain or defend, he was asked to stop, not silenced, but challenged, to listen, to sit in discomfort and let it reshape him. And over time, it did. Slowly, sharply, not into someone else, but into the version of himself that might have made a different choice on that plane. Skylux monitored his progress with cautious optimism. The company had suffered heavy financial blows, stock dips, and customer boycotts after the incident. But the public responded favorably to the authenticity of the reform, not performative firings or generic apologies, but a long, expensive, and transparent process rooted in change. The teenager who filmed Isaiah became a guest speaker at several public forums. Isaiah himself had declined interviews, preferring his influence to remain quiet, strategic. Until now, 1 year to the day after Flight 930, Skylux hosted a closed-door leadership summit in Washington, D.C., attended by executives, regulators, customer service leaders, and select crew alumni from the program. Derek sat near the back of the conference hall, wearing a dark suit, his face leaner, his expression more grounded. He was no longer the confident, glib man who had stood at a gate and judged a stranger by his skin and suit. He was quieter now, less interested in being right, more invested in being honest. As the keynote speaker was introduced, the room shifted. Isaiah Freeman stepped onto the stage with the same deliberate calm he had shown at 30,000 feet. He wore a charcoal suit, tailored but simple, and carried no notes. The room silenced itself. He began not with a speech, but with a question. What does power look like when it's ignored? The question hung in the air. He answered it. Sometimes it wears a modest suit and sits quietly in the back row. Sometimes it boards without assistance. Sometimes it chooses not to speak, not because it can't, but because it wants to give others the chance to see what they really are. He paused. What we witnessed last year was not just a failure of service. It was a failure of attention, a failure of listening. And in the silence that followed, some people chose to change. He spoke for 15 minutes. Not about himself, not about the incident, but about responsibility, about recognition, about the difference between embarrassment and accountability. And when he was done, he stepped down without applause, as he had requested. Instead, the room remained silent in reverence. After the summit ended, attendees formed quiet circles of reflection. Derek stood alone near the back, then finally approached Isaiah at the edge of the room. Isaiah saw him coming, said nothing, only waited. Derek stopped 2 feet away and took a slow breath. "I'm not here for forgiveness," he said. "You don't owe me that. I just want to say thank you." Isaiah tilted his head slightly. Derek continued. "Thank you for not reacting the way I expected. Thank you for letting me live with my actions long enough to change them." Isaiah studied him for a long moment, then said, "Growth isn't a favor. It's a debt. You're paying it. That's a start." Derek nodded. "I'm trying." They stood there a moment longer, 2 men whose paths had once crossed in injustice, now intersecting again in transformation. No handshake was offered. None was needed. Just the shared understanding that the world had moved forward inch by inch, and so had they. Outside the summit, protest signs had been replaced by murals. One, painted by a local artist, depicted Isaiah sitting in seat 2A, eyes turned to the window, the shadow of a private jet outside his frame. Above it were 3 words, "Stillness is strength." It became the closing image on Skylux's new employee training modules. Not as a trophy, not as propaganda, but as a reminder. Every seat holds a story. Every face deserves dignity. Every silence could be a storm waiting to move. The end. If you found this story powerful or thought-provoking, take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps support this kind of meaningful storytelling. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the twists in the plot? Did any part of Isaiah's journey or Derek's transformation stand out to you? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I'm reading every one. Let's talk about what justice, redemption, and real change look like.